friends, it's Ms Tracy from the Danbury Library, and welcome to another episode of Globe Trekkers. Today, we're going to be exploring Europe. Europe may not be the biggest continent, but it has so many countries that we're actually going to be making this a two-part episode. In the first part, we're going to be visiting Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe, and Southwestern Europe, and reading some stories about European countries. In the second part, we'll be visiting Southern Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. And we'll be making a craft. So are you ready to explore Europe with me? Let's go.
For today's adventure, we're going to be using two atlases that you can find on Hoopla using your library card. Well, first we'll be using the Lonely Planet Kids Amazing World Atlas and also the Young People's Atlas of the World. Last time on Globe Trekkers, we discovered there are 7 continents or land masses in the world. These include North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Oceania, and Antarctica. Today, we're going to be traveling to Europe. Europe may not be one of the biggest continents in the world, but there are so many different countries to explore. Today, we're going to be visiting many of them and hearing about different people, places, and languages. There are snowy northern forests, green fields, and woods full of wildflowers, moors, and heaths. There are awesome mountain ranges such as the Alps and lowlands created by rolling rivers. There are olive groves, vineyards, and sunny beaches. In the north, Europe borders the icy Arctic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean brings rain to the western shores. And Europe's sunny south meets the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The continent stretches eastwards to the Caucasus and Ural Mountains, and beyond lies Asia. In fact, Europe and Asia together make up one mega landmass called Eurasia. As well as Europe's big modern cities, you can see prehistoric stone circles, beautiful cathedrals and castles from the Middle Ages, and factories and railways from the industrial age of the 1800s. At that time, European empires ruled large parts of the world, spreading languages such as Spanish, French, and English around the globe. 5 nations crossed the divide between Europe and Asia: Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. We'll talk about them later when we talk about Asia. First, let's talk about Northern Europe. Here, we will explore Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, and Sweden. You know you are way up near the Arctic Circle when the skies flash green and pink with the northern lights, when it stays light all night at midsummer and is dark during the days of midwinter. Welcome to Europe's far north. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are sometimes known as Scandinavia. This region includes forests of spruce and birch, lakes, mountains, and deep sea inlets called fjords. Winters are snowy, but summers can be warm and sunny. The living is easy in the farms and the cities of the south. Iceland is known for its volcanoes and hot springs, which provide heat and power for housing and greenhouses. Across the Baltic Sea is Finland, another land of lakes and forests, which has its capital at Helsinki. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have historical links with Germany and Poland, and were part of the Soviet Union, now Russia, until 1991. So who lives in the northern part of Europe? Well, the Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, and Icelanders are all Germanic people and speak closely related languages. The Sami, Finns, and Estonians are also related. The Letts or Latvians and the Lithuanians are called Baltic peoples. Here are some fun facts about Northern Europe. Reykjavik the capital of Iceland, is the world's northernmost national capital. In Copenhagen, Denmark, you'll find a statue of the Little Mermaid, whose story was originally told by Hans Christian Andersen. Scandinavia was once home to the Vikings. About 1200 years ago, the Vikings were brilliant seafarers and traders. They were fearsome warriors too, and some had scary names like Erik Bloodaxe. In Norway, an ancient rock carving suggests people were skiing there about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And do you like Legos? Well, Lego was first made in Denmark back in 1949. Since then, about 560 billion bricks, parts, and figures have been manufactured. And where better to see them than at the Legoland theme park in Denmark, right next door to the original Lego factory. Next, let's go to Northwestern Europe. Here, you'll find Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Monaco, Netherlands, the Republic of Ireland, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Atlantic breakers roll in to meet high cliffs on the west coast of Ireland, a land of green grass and low hills. Northern Ireland, together with England, Scotland, and Wales on the larger island of Great Britain, is part of the United Kingdom. Here you travel through rolling farmland, moors and highlands, small villages, historic market towns, and large, busy cities such as London. England is linked to France by a rail tunnel beneath the Channel. A high-speed TGV train whisks you to Paris, or southwards through vineyards and river valleys to the warm and sunny Mediterranean coast and the little city-state of Monaco. High mountains occupy the southeast of France, part of the Alpine ranges. Switzerland, tiny Liechtenstein, and Austria are beautiful countries with rich histories and cultures. Germany stretches from the Alps to the North and Baltic Seas, crossed by great rivers such as the Rhine and the Elbe. Here the forests and heaths, mountains and plains, with many large industrial cities as well as historic castles and traditional houses. Who lives in Northern Europe? The countries of Northwest Europe grew up over hundreds of years from a patchwork of smaller states. A visitor might think of the nationalities as simply French, German, Dutch, or Swiss. But within the borders, there are in fact many people. Scots, Welsh, Bretons, Walloons, Flemings, Frisians, Swabians, Moravians. Even little Switzerland has 4 official languages: French, Swiss German, Italian, and Romish. Europe's historical overseas empires mean that many people are also descended from African, Asian, and Caribbean roots. In Northwestern Europe, you'll discover that in the Netherlands, the Dutch grow about 3 billion tulip bulbs each year and export them around the world. In Germany, they produce over 5.4 million cars each year. Paris, France, you'll not only find the fashion capital of the world, but also the iconic Eiffel Tower, which was built for the 1889's World Fair. And if you love sports, many sports were invented in Northwestern Europe. Golf and curling come from Scotland. Cricket, rugby, and modern football or soccer come from England. And tennis is from France. Next, let's go southwestern Europe. Here, along the Mediterranean, you'll find Andorra, the Balearic Islands, Gibraltar, Portugal, and Spain. A big slab of land juts out from Europe into the Atlantic Ocean, below the stormy Bay of Biscay. This is the Iberian Peninsula, divided between Spain and Portugal. It is separated from France by high mountains called the Pyrenees, where tourists visit the mini-state of Andorra. Spain is rimmed by other mountains around the central flat Meseta region. Spain's northwest coast is green from Atlantic rains, but much of the country is dry and dusty. Spain can be sweltering hot in the summer. There are villages of small white houses, oranges and lemons, fields of sunflowers and olive trees. You can see castles and ornate Roman Catholic cathedrals, and in the south, the Islamic palaces and fountains of the Moors, who ruled there in the Middle Ages. Madrid is the biggest city. At Spain's southern tip, the Great Rock of Gibraltar is UK territory, just 14 kilometers or 9 miles from the coast of Africa. In Portugal, there are river valleys and forests of cork oak, fishing villages and beaches by the Atlantic surf, and the historic port of Lisbon. So who lives in southwestern Europe? The Spanish and Portuguese languages have spread around the world. The Iberian Peninsula has a patchwork of peoples and cultures. Some have their own languages or dialects. The Catalans live in the northeast around Barcelona, as well as Andorra and France. The Basque capital is Vitoria-Gasteiz. The Basques speak a language that is not related to any other in Europe. In Spain, you can see amazing cave paintings of animals and hunters. They were made between 13,000 and 17,000 years ago, but still look as if they were painted yesterday. In Spain, there are many festivals throughout the year. At Banol, in the Valencia region of Spain, people gather each August to spend an hour throwing 150,000 squashed tomatoes at each other. If you love the ocean and surfing, the largest wave that was ever surfed was found off the coast of Portugal.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today and traveled to so many different countries. Now, let's hear some traditional folk tales from around Europe. First, we're going to travel back to Northern Europe, Latvia. Today's stories come from the book A Year Full of Stories, 52 Folktales and Legends from Around the World, written by Angela McAllister and illustrated by Christopher Core, and published by Francis Lincoln's Children's Books. The first story is called The Empty Barn. It's a Latvian story. Long ago, there was a farmer who had 3 sons, Valdis, Vilis, and Theodors. Valdis and Vilis were tall and strong, but Theodors was young and couldn't match his brother's strength. One day, their father said, "Sons, this farm is doing well. Our fields grow golden wheat, our meadows feed sturdy cows, and our hens lay the best eggs. But the old barn has a leaky roof and rotten timbers. It's time to pull it down and build a new one." Valdis and Vilis started to work at once, pulling down the old barn. Theodors rolled up his sleeves. "Let me help," he said, wanting to do something to make his father proud. But his brothers just laughed. "You're not strong enough with those twigs you call arms," they shouted. "It takes muscles like ours to tear down a barn." But Theodors was left to pick up any bits and pieces from the old barn that he thought might come in useful. When they finished, Valdis and Vilis harnessed the horse to the wagon and went into the forest to chop down trees for a new barn. Theodors ran after them. "Let me chop down a tree," he begged. "Go on, let me try." Valdis winked at Vilis. "There's a fine straight pine," he said. "Chop that down, little brother." Theodors grabbed the axe, but though he tugged with all his might, he wasn't even strong enough to lift it. With a sigh, he gave up and looked after the horse instead. Valdis and Vilis chopped down the trees they needed, lifted them onto the wagon, and brought them back to the farm. Then they began to build the new barn. I can help pull the rope and raise the frame, cried Theodore's. But his brothers shook their heads. You don't weigh more than a piglet, they chuckled. You'd make no difference at all. Theodore's tried not to look disappointed and made himself useful by shooing the chickens and ducks out of the way. All the while, the farmer sat in his rocking chair on the porch, watching everything. For 3 days, Valdis and Villis worked on the barn. Theodore's wasn't strong enough to lift the beams or raise the rafters, so he fetched ladders and carried tools for his brothers. Every time Valdis needed a hammer, Theodore had one ready. Whenever Villis ran out of nails, Theodore was standing by with a handful. They even used some of the bits and pieces they'd saved from the old barn. Then it was time for the roof. While Valdis and Villis sawed and hammered and heaved and puffed, Theodore's made a little nesting box for the wagtails and fixed it under the eaves. All the while, the farmer sat in his rocking chair and watched thoughtfully. At last, the huge doors were hung and the new barn was finished. Sons, this is a fine barn, said the farmer. I'm proud to see how strong and clever you are. Whichever one of you can fill the empty barn in a day can have my rocking chair. We're ready for a rest, laughed Valdis and Valdis. The next morning, Valdis looked around for something to fill the barn. He spotted the cows in the meadow. Those are the biggest beasts on the farm, he thought. They'll fill the barn. So he led the cows out of the meadow into the yard. But the cows had been enjoying sweet grass in the meadow, and they didn't want to go into the barn. Valdis pushed and shoved. He dragged them by the horns and dug in his heels hard, but as soon as he got one cow through the door, another barged out again. All day he heaved the stubborn cows into the barn and chased after the ones that had escaped. But by the end of the day, he had finally had them all inside. Well, Valdis, said his father, you have filled the barn from wall to wall, but you haven't filled up the roof. Valdis sighed wearily and led the cows back to the meadow. The next morning, Villis headed for the field. We've grown plenty of wheat this year, he thought. That should fill the empty barn. So he loaded up the wagon with sheaves of wheat and took it back to the yard. As he heaved the wheat in and out, it scratched and tickled and poked his ears. But back and forth he went, hour after hour, until at last the fields were empty. Well, Villis, said his father, you filled the barn to the roof, but not from wall to wall. Villis frowned and mopped his brow. Then he began to carry the wheat out again. By the time he had emptied the barn, it was dark. Your turn tomorrow, Theodore, said his father, but Theodore shook his head. No, I'm ready now, father, he said with a mysterious smile. I won't take long. Theodore's father and brothers were puzzled. They watched as he walked into the barn and took something out of his pocket. It was a bundle of candles that he had saved from the old barn. Theodore placed the candles around the barn and lit them carefully. One by one, a dozen little flames flickered, and then they grew, shining brightly and filling the whole barn with a golden light. Clever boy, cried his father. You filled every inch of the empty barn, from wall to wall and floor to roof. The rocking chair is yours. Theodore grinned proudly. You keep it, father, he said. I haven't got time to sit on a rocking chair. I'm going to work hard to grow as tall and strong as Villis and Valdis. Then the barn was filled again with the laughter of the farmer and his 3 sons. It might take you a while to grow as tall and strong as your brothers, Theodore, said his father, but you'll always be the cleverest. Finally, let's travel back to the United Kingdom and England, and we're going to read a story traditionally told on Halloween. The Buried Moon, an English story. Long ago, wicked things haunted the watery marshlands. On dark nights, eerie lanterns that lured travelers away from the paths where slithering creatures in dangerous bogs and murky pools waited to drag them to a gruesome fate. The moon heard tales of these terrors and wished to know if they were true. So she wrapped herself in a black cloak, pulled the hood over her head, and stepped down to the marshland. Cautiously, the moon crept through the marsh. At the edge of the slimy pool, her foot slipped. She reached out for a branch to save herself from falling, but to her horror, woody fingers twined around her wrist and gripped her tight. She was trapped. The moon tugged and twisted, but she couldn't free herself. Then a frightened voice whimpered in the darkness. A man had strayed from the path and was squelching through the bog, heading for a lantern light he hoped was a sign for safety. Only the moon heard the slobbering creatures waiting to grab him. At once she took her hood off from her shining hair, casting her moonbeams across the marsh, and the crawling terrors shrieked and squirmed back into the bog. The man cried with joy at seeing the path once more. He hurried back to safety with little more than a glance over his shoulder at the light that had saved him. Now the moon was once again alone without any hope of help. She sank to her knees, and the hood fell over her head once more. But she had given herself away. As soon as it was dark again, the wicked creatures emerged from the bog and clamored around her, screeching and plucking at her with bony fingers. They hated the moon's light. After a squabble, they decided to bury her deep in the pool at the foot of the tree and roll a huge stone on top of her. Intending to return to gloat, they left a ghostly lantern to mark its place. Days passed, and the moon didn't appear in the sky. The people who lived by the marsh grew fearful, and the creatures of the bog became bold, creeping up to their houses at night to claw at the windows. Nobody could guess what had happened to the moon, until one evening a traveler at an inn told his story. "I believe I saw her," he said. "I was last in the marsh on a dark night when a light as soft as a moonbeam showed me the path and saved me from certain death." When the men of the marshland heard this, they hurried to the wise woman of the village and to ask her advice. The wise woman consulted her brewpot. "Tonight you must go to the marsh," she said. "Look for a coffin, a cross, and a candle. There you may find the moon. But first put stones in your mouths, for you mustn't speak a word until you are safe home again." The men waited for dusk and then did as she asked. They picked their way nervously around the bogs until they found the huge stone rising from the water like a coffin. Looking up, they saw 2 crossed branches and the ghostly lantern flickering like a candle. Without a word, they lifted the stone, and to their relief, the marsh was flooded with light. The grateful moon leaped out of the water and back into the sky. And ever since that night, the moon has shone more brightly for the people of the marshland than anyone else. The end.
I hope you enjoyed part 1 of Globe Trekkers Europe. Stay tuned for part 2.